Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the second Fall 2020 virtual program sponsored by the St. Louis Public Library Stedman Architectural Library and the St. Louis chapter of the Society of Architectural Historians. We're so pleased to have you join us. My name is Chris Impastato, and I'm the Fine Arts Senior Subject Specialist and Manager of the Stedman Architectural Library. Just to go over a few housekeeping details for the program, questions will be answered at the conclusion of the talk. So go ahead and just type them up or type them in the chat box. You can find that at the bottom of your screen in chat. You should be muted and your camera can be on or off. But, go ahead and, if you're not muted, please go ahead and mute yourself. If there is a problem, just go ahead and put that in the chat box. I'm going to be monitoring that this evening during the program. So I will do my best to assist with any issues. Now I'll turn the proceedings over to John Gunther, and John is the president of the Society of Architectural Historians of the St. Louis chapter and the Missouri Valley chapter. And John will introduce tonight's speaker.
Thank you very much, Chris, and welcome to everyone. It's indeed a distinct privilege to introduce our speaker tonight, Esley Hamilton, who really doesn't need an introduction, but I will do it anyway. Historian, preservationist, critic, the answer man, irreplaceable, tenacious, a force to be reckoned with, a bridge between the profession and the public, a library on feet, and a St. Louis treasure are but a few of the ways people have described Esley Hamilton. Simply put, Esley Hamilton is the most knowledgeable and admired figure in historic preservation in St. Louis and well beyond. For 40 years, he has served as preservation historian for the St. Louis County Parks and Recreation Department. He retired as preservation historian after cataloging more than 4,000 county buildings and adding 300 properties and 8 historic districts to the National Register of Historic Places. In 2014, Esley was one of 4 professionals to be honored in Washington, D.C. at the Secretary of the Interior Historic Preservation Awards ceremony, winning in the Certified Local Government category. In 2013, Esley Hamilton was one of 5 nationally to be selected as an honorary member recipient of the American Institute of Architects. He is also an honorary member of AIA St. Louis, and a recipient of the President's Award of the Landmarks Association of St. Louis. Esley is also a trustee of the National Association of Olmsted Parks. He is our editor and contributing author of the newsletter of the Society of Architectural Historians St. Louis chapter. He generously shares his encyclopedic knowledge of architectural history here and abroad through countless speeches, writing, and good counsel. Tonight, Esley will talk about St. Mary, Aldermanbury. Destroyed in the Great Fire of London in 1666, rebuilt by one of the greatest Baroque architects, Sir Christopher Wren, from 1672 to 1677. And he will tell us how it came to be reconstructed in Fulton, Missouri. And now, please welcome Esley Hamilton as he presents Christopher Wren's St. Mary, Aldermanbury, a masterwork of English Baroque in Fulton, Missouri. Esley?
Thank you very much, John. I'm hoping that everybody is looking at the title slide and not at a picture of me that's blocking the words Wren and church. If you are seeing something different than that, please put a note in so that Chris can correct that, because I don't want to be intruding on the image the whole way through the talk. But Wren was the greatest English architect of the 17th century, and he was one of the very few architects in history who was able to complete a cathedral that he had started himself, St. Paul's. The reason why we have an example of Wren's work in Fulton, Missouri goes back to an important event that took place there in 1946. When President Harry S. Truman invited Winston Churchill to come to Westminster College and give the graduation speech. And Churchill responded with one of the key addresses really of the post-war era, when he defined what came to be known as the Iron Curtain. this name of the speech was called Sinews of Peace. And he said, as you know, from Stettin in the north to Trieste in the south, an iron curtain is coming down across the European continent. And of course, fortunately, those of us who were alive then lived to see that curtain withdrawn in 1989 and 1991. But in the meantime, in the 1960s, there was a movement to create a memorial to that speech in Fulton. And one of the ideas was to take one of the damaged churches that were left over in central London from World War II and to move the whole church to the campus of Westminster College. And that's what they did. It was dedicated in 1969, and they just celebrated the 50th anniversary of that event last year. And this is what it looks like now, sitting on the edge of a hill. This is the north side, and this is the south side and the west side, showing the statue of Churchill in front of the church, and then to the left, a segment of the Berlin Wall, which was removed and moved to Fulton by Winston Churchill's granddaughter,
Thames,
who was a sculptor herself. And so I will be coming back to how that occurred specifically, but first I want to review why this church is significant. And one of the reasons is that it was one of the very first Protestant churches built in after the Reformation. Here's what London looked like in 1616. This was drawn by Wenceslas Haller, who was a famous Czech artist who came to England and recorded many things that we wouldn't know about without him. At this time, the city of London, which is only a little bit more than a square mile or 640 acres, had over 100 churches. And the reason for that was that, of course, everyone was in church on Sunday morning, and London was one of the most densely populated cities in Europe at that time. So these churches were relatively small in size, but you needed a lot of them to accommodate the population. In this view, on the left in the distance, you can see the old St. Paul's Cathedral, which was actually one of the largest cathedrals in England at that time. And on the lower right, you're seeing the parish church of Southwark or Southwark, which was the parish on the other side of the London Bridge. Today, that's called Southwark Cathedral. This is a map that shows what we just were looking at, and you can see Southwark at the bottom. The city originally had a moat, which I was not aware of until recently, and the Tower of London was at the east end of the moat, and there was another castle called Baynard's Castle at the left, on the west side. The gates that are now the street names actually corresponded to the original gates of the walled city. And this shows a little bit more than the whole legal city of London today, but it gives you an idea of the incredible effect that the Great Fire of 1666 had. The dark red at the entrance to the bridge is how much burned the first day, and the red is how much burned the second day. So you can see it was absolutely catastrophic. Every church except for a few of them that were in that light pink area on the right was burned down, including the cathedral. There's a little bit of area outside the burned area on the left side that survived, and that includes the Church of the Inner Temple, which was originally a Knights Templars church that you can still see today. Here's a drawing by, or a woodcut actually, by Wenceslas Haller from 1666, showing the cathedral on fire. And the people didn't expect the cathedral to catch fire initially, as you can see from that other map. And when it did catch fire, the lead roofing material melted and ran down through the gargoyles, creating ponds and puddles of molten lead all around the perimeter of the church, which prevented firefighters from getting to it. And this seems very relevant today because, of course, Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris caught fire at the roof level also. But fortunately, the vaulting in Notre Dame was stone, erected in the 1100s rather, and that protected the interior of the cathedral. But St. Paul's didn't have that kind of vaulting, and so the whole cathedral burned down. And this is what it looked like 7 years later, I guess 8 years later, when some of the outer walls had even collapsed, and so it was almost impossible to save it. And not to mention the fact that Gothic architecture was pretty much out of style, even in England. So this large burned area had to be rebuilt because this was the center of the whole economy for the nation of England. And so a few more foresighted architects and scientists, such as Robert Hooke, suggested master plans. And this was Wren's idea. You can see St. Paul's at the sharp point of the triangle in the western part. And if you follow that straight street to the right, that's where the Exchange and the Bank of England were located, in another large square that he proposed. But England did not have a very centralized government at this point. And so in contrast to Paris in the 19th century, where they had strong controls that enabled the government to do just about what they wanted, in this case, they would have had to buy each property and then reassemble them to create this new street pattern. And that was just way beyond their administrative capacity. And they decided it would take too long to get the economy going in. If they had followed that idea, it would have looked a little bit like this, which I think is a great drawing just from a few years ago, suggesting what London would have looked like if all the Wren's churches were built in the same place where they were actually built, and the cathedral also, but all the streets were following his plan. And the one that you can see just above the column in the foreground with the small dome is St. Stephen Walbrook. We'll see that later. The column was something that was actually created by Wren, and we'll see some other examples of that. And that was to commemorate the Great Fire, and it was erected on the site where the fire was supposed to have started, in somebody's overheating oven. Here's what the city actually looked like at the end of the 18th century. It did have these wonderful marble and white limestone churches scattered throughout, but the rest of the fabric of the city was mostly Georgian row houses, which today we would think were just wonderfully picturesque and scenic, but by the mid 19th century they were considered just awful, and that's what Charles Dickens was writing about in some of his novels. Now, turning to the question of Protestant churches, when Martin Luther put his 95 Thesis on the church at Wittenberg in 1519, and people started changing the practice in the churches, they really didn't need any new churches because they were taking over the existing Catholic churches. And not only that, but as the Catholic orders, the monks and nuns were dissolved, that left a whole other layer of churches to use. So in the early first 2 centuries of Protestantism, more churches were torn down than were built. But the very first one was Hartenfels Castle, which was the secondary castle for the Elector of Saxony, who was Frederick the Wise, who was one of the most important leaders of the Reformation movement. And this is still standing on the banks of the River Elbe today. And you can see that it combines a lot of Gothic features. All these arches, even though they're rounded, kind of follow what the look of a castle church would have looked like. The important difference is that more and more the churches were designed to focus on the pulpit rather than on the altar. And you can even see in this view, the altar is just a table. It's not an elaborate composition with a reredos or rear painting or sculpture. And that was, generally speaking, was minimized. The second one, Protestant church, built just the next year, is in a setting that looks very similar. It's Neuberg Castle in Bavaria, and this is on the banks of the Danube River. This was the one Protestant branch of the Wittelsbach family, and this shows the interior on the right, which shows that the Renaissance was becoming more advanced all the time in the 1500s. In England, there were even fewer Protestant churches built. One that survived the Great Fire was St. Catherine Cree, built in the early 1600s. And you could see that this combines classical arcades, like something you would see in a church by Brunelleschi, with traceried windows and the spider web pattern of the vaulting. So it's really a very transitional building, and it's a remarkable survival with almost all the original glass also. Another English church from the 17th century that was built right in the middle of the Civil War, when Oliver Cromwell was governing the country and the economy had gone down to almost to nothing. But this was privately built using the money of this landowner at Staunton Herald. And it is even more Gothic than St. Catherine Cree, at least on the outside. There's one 18th century church or 17th century church in the United States. It's the Old Ship Meeting House in Cohasset, Massachusetts. And it has, as you can see on the right, the box pews, which were typical of that time, which created rather tall partitions between the seating areas. And you can see very clearly that the pulpit is above the altar table. And in fact, the altar table is like a drop leaf table there. And it's called the Old Ship Church because the structure of the roof is built like the hull of a ship. The true Renaissance architecture came to England with Inigo Jones, who was a court designer for James I and later Charles I. And when Charles married Henrietta Maria of France, she was Catholic and wanted her own chapel. So he created the Queen's Chapel for her, which was really the first Renaissance place of worship. It wasn't a Protestant church, though, because it was for Catholic practice. It still is used for worship today, but the format they use varies from depending on the circumstances. The other church that Inigo Jones designed was part of the Covent Garden, a large development that was sponsored by the Duke of Bedford. And the east end of the church opened onto the square where the large Covent Garden Market House was located. And so Jones created this classical portico, which he called Tuscan, based on not Greek temples, but temples from Etruria in Italy. Of course, that wasn't the entrance. The primary entrance was on the west side, which was in the cemetery of the church. And that's what you see on the right with the brick. And this then became a model for later churches, but only briefly. So when the Great Fire occurred, Wren was a mathematics professor at Oxford University. This bust shows him in 1673, about the age of 40. He had already been doing architecture for about 8 years, and he had just been knighted the previous year. He was a student at Wadham College and then a fellow at All Souls in both mathematics and astronomy. And he also was a visiting professor at Gresham College in London up till 1661. He became a surveyor for Charles II later in 1661. But he was still doing primarily teaching at that point. The first major building that he designed was Pembroke College Chapel. His uncle was the master of Pembroke College and asked him to do this. And you can see it's just essentially a narrow shoebox, but classically articulated. And it has what they call the collegiate seating style, like the choir of a cathedral, with pews facing each other rather than facing the altar. And some of the churches in London were later used this plan also. At the same time, he was invited to create an auditorium in Oxford that was not so much for theater, but although it's used for that now, but it was for academic lectures and important rituals of the academic year at Oxford. And this followed Palladio's church theater design that was in his 4 books of architecture. And this has just recently been beautifully restored to its original appearance. So this is a map that shows all the churches that were burned down. And as I mentioned earlier, about half of the burned churches were not rebuilt, but there were still quite a few that needed work. And the effect of this over a period of nearly a quarter of a century was to change the whole skyline of London. And there are 2 famous views of the skyline of London that were painted in the 1750s by Canaletto, the Venetian painter who spent several years in England. And this is from Richmond House, which would be close to the Houses of Parliament today. And as you're looking at this, the large garden that you see further downstream on the river on the left is Somerset House. And the 2 churches immediately behind that are St. Mary's and St. Clement's, which are in the middle of the road of the Strand. And those spires are by James Gibbs, the Scottish architect. But the largest one that's closest to the St. Paul's Cathedral is St. Bride's, which we'll see later. The second painting that he did was actually taken from the garden of Somerset House, which we just saw. And here's the whole width of the river with all those spires. And here's a close-up of that, showing the area immediately around the cathedral. The one that's right practically in front of the cathedral is a little church called St. Martin's. And most of those spires are still standing, although you can hardly see them with the built-up skyline of London today. Here's another view from 1770, and in this one, the spectacular spire in the center is St. Mary Le Beau. That's the second of the three most significant spires that he designed. And that's also important in the cultural definition of who is a Cockney, because the original definition was anybody who was born within the sound of the bells at St. Mary Le Beau could describe himself as a Cockney. Well, the churches started to be built around 1670, and the spires were mostly built about 10 to 20 years later, but they were always planned from the beginning. The whole project was pretty much wrapped up by 1690, but already in less than a century, they started tearing down the churches, because as the city became more and more commercial and legal center and financial center, there were fewer and fewer people living there to attend these churches, and they just couldn't keep them up. In the view on the left, you can see St. Christopher Lestats, which was the very first church to be demolished. And in the view on the right, you can see that it backed up immediately to the original Bank of England. And of course, originally the Bank of England took over that whole section of town, including in this left-hand slide, you can see a second church in the distance. And that one, St. Bartholomew's by the Exchange, was also torn down in 1840. There were only two other demolitions in the early 19th century. This is St. Michael's Crooked Lane. And you can see on the left, this drawing shows that the city was constantly being rebuilt, and they were taking what I think had been the parish cemetery and turning it into a building site. You can also see in these, by comparing these two pictures, the very complex ground plan that some of these sites had. From the street elevation of the church, you can just barely see the actual body of the church, which is hidden by a building that was erected in front of it. You can only see it from the side. And this was one of the challenges that Wren faced in designing details of these churches. The third early church was St. Bennet Fink, which was also torn down to expand the Royal Exchange, which was a little bit like the stock exchange in New York. It had a exchange floor, but it later became more like a condominium for offices. But you can see this was one of the most interesting ones in terms of plan. It had this octagonal or polygonal shape to it, and also an unusual spire, and it was very small in scale. Starting in 1860, the church officials wanted to combine more of these parishes, and so they Parliament passed an act called the Union of Benefices Act, and this allowed 7 of the churches to be torn down. This was St. Anthelin, another polygonal church. And on the left, you can see a plaque, a memorial to St. Anthelin that's still standing affixed to the side of another church. And this is what the interior of it looked like. There's a church in the Netherlands that's very similar to this, but otherwise it's unique, I think, in Wren's career. St. Michael Queenhithe, demolished in 1876. St. Diana's Back Church, and this is important because we're looking at the entrance side, the west side here, with the organ up in the choir loft. But if we were facing the other way, you would see the screens that blocked off the twin vestries. A vestry is like in Catholic Church, it would be called the sacristy, where the holy elements are kept between services. In British Protestant vocabulary, it was called a vestry because it was primarily the place where the presiding clergy changed into their official robes. St. Matthew Friday Street was one of my favorite because of this arcade at the top. It's the only church that had that, but it was also one of the first to be demolished, as you can see. In fact, Friday Street doesn't even exist anymore in London, but the reredos, the back panel behind the altar, is still existing at Polesden Lacey, which is a country house not far from central London that's now protected by the National Trust in England. And the doors actually were the doors into the vestry of this church. All Hallows was torn down in 1894, not very impressive on the outside, but it had great woodwork. And we'll see the screen again because that was moved to another church that's still standing. And the pulpit of this church, which I think you can see in the right hand behind the screen in this view, is now in our church, St. Mary Aldermanbury in Fulton. And I'll talk more about that later. St. Michael Bassishaw, demolished in 1900, was less than a block from St. Mary Aldermanbury. And it was the first one that was torn down because it actually became structurally unsound. One of the problems with these churches is that wherever possible, Wren tried to build the church on the original foundations of the older church to save money. There were a few, such as St. Mary's, that were all larger than the previous church, but sometimes those medieval foundations would later give way. Of course, the biggest loss of Wren churches occurred because of the Blitz, which started, of course, at the end of 1940, and most of the damage was done then in 1941. But there was a renewal using rockets in 1944, and further damage was done then. This is the famous view of the dome of St. Paul's, kind of riding the waves, the crest of all this smoke over the burning city. And it did have one direct hit, but it was an incendiary bomb that was put out immediately. So it's remarkable that this survived when so many other buildings didn't. So among the three churches that were totally just blown up so that there was nothing left, there were three. St. Stephen here at Coleman Street, and I want to point this out because this is a good example of how irregular the sites were. And Wren would often just use optical illusions to give you the idea that the church was rectangular, but you can see it doesn't have a right angle in the whole church. And that actually, to me, adds to the appeal of some of these buildings. St. Mildred Bread Street was just a block or two from St. Mary's, and it had this very interesting obelisk-like spire, which was leaded at the top, and there was nothing left of it. And unfortunately, it had one of the most interesting plans, this dome that was just carefully slipped into the rectangular surround. And here you're looking on the left to the entrance side of the church with the organ in the choir loft again, and that huge triumphal arch there. St. Swithin was also torn down in the 60s. This was still available when they were shopping for destroyed churches, but you can see from the plan it's rather small. And it was quite interesting on the inside, and I think the leading of the central window is especially interesting. If you look below the window, there's a little opening there that looks like it would be a place for a drinking fountain. That was where the so-called London Stone was housed, and that was the official starting point for all distances from London. And that still is standing on the site of the office building that eventually replaced this. 6 of the churches were only left in the form of towers. And the one on the left is one of the most beautiful, I think, of Wren's, St. Dunstan in the east. In the middle is St. Mary Somerset, and on the right is St. Augustine, which is right next to the cathedral. You can see the back apse of the cathedral to the left in this picture. And instead of building a church there, they built the new school for the choir of the cathedral. So that helped to keep this standing. And the upper part of it, which was originally lead, is now fiberglass. St. Olaf, the church had already been demolished in 1892, and there is a new building on the site for offices. St. Alban Wood Street is just a half a block away from St. Mary Aldermanbury, and we'll see an aerial view of that later. But you can see that quite a bit of the original church was left, and so this is one that was most forthrightly Gothic revival in style. And the original chancel had this strap work, but the apse that we're looking at in the picture here was built later in the 19th century. And you can see the tower on the left. The only thing that was left of the tower was just that. Even the little vestibule next to it was torn down. And I thought this was interesting because the first picture was taken in 1967, and the second one was taken in 2017. And you can see how much denser London is now. In the 60s, it was still being rebuilt. There were quite a few vacant lots, but now they've even torn down some of the buildings you can see in the left-hand slide that were new then. Christchurch Newgate Street was left as an outdoor garden. And one of the reasons for this was the beautiful spire. This is usually thought of as the third of the greatest spires of the London churches. It's like almost like a wedding cake effect. And in this slide, you can see at the bottom, a great deal of the church was actually left after the bombing. But when the road had to be widened in the 1980s, they took the whole east wall of the church down. So, and now it looks absolutely horrible. So, which is too bad because there's not even a nice quiet place to relax in the garden part of it. Now, there were some churches that were rebuilt totally, except for the outer walls and a few other details. In some cases, the fittings had already been removed. And there are 8 of those, including some of the most interesting surviving ones. This is St. Andrew by the Wardrobe. Marshall Sisson did this renovation, and he was also the architect for our project from the London end. And this is what it looks like now with this lighter woodwork instead of the dark oak or black walnut that you think of normally. St. Anne and St. Agnes was one of the most classically designed churches, built around a 4-columned central space, very much as described by Andrea Palladio in his book. And this was saved because it was given to a Lutheran congregation. And here you can see that ceiling with the 4 columns. You see that kind of a 4-column space in many British Neo-Palladian buildings of the 18th century also. St. Bride's, which I mentioned earlier with the spectacular tower with its many, like the Russian doll kind of stages to it. This was the church for Bedlam Hospital, the Hospital of Bethlehem, which was later, of course, the the mental hospital for the city. This is on the left is what the church looked like originally, looking toward the west entrance. But from the street side, you can barely find the west entrance because it's surrounded on all sides by buildings. The other thing about the interior is this is a very good example of the galleries. Many of these churches had galleries because people wanted to be as close to the preacher as possible. Whereas in the Catholic churches, that hadn't been significant. It was the ritual of the Mass that was important. And many of those galleries have been removed now, but this gives you an idea of what those look like. And this is how it was restored, which was a shock to many people. The architect Godfrey Allen really radically altered the interior and turned it into a kind of a modified collegiate plan with the pews facing toward the center rather than to the altar. St. Lawrence Jewry became the official church of the Guildhall, which is the government of the City of London. And so it was very lavishly restored. In the plan, you can see again that the front and the back are not parallel, but Wren designed the tower so that it would look parallel to the east front, which is what you see in the slide on the left, because that was the way most people would see it. Now there's a park on the west side also, and that really shows up the twisted proportions of the west elevation. On the left is the way it looked before, and on the right is the way it looks now, which is, it still has a lot of the similarities, except that most of the wall monuments are missing. There's one that you can see in the far distance there. St. Mary Le Beau, I mentioned earlier that this was another church that only the tower could be seen from the street. You had to go through an alley to get to it. And it was totally bombed out. This was a church that was, that they considered for Fulton, but they, the city couldn't let it go because of the importance of the tower. And it was restored or rebuilt, I should say, by Lawrence King in 1964. And this has been very criticized also. The blue ceiling is the part that I find objectionable. St. Michael, Paternoster Royal, was reconstructed so that only half of the nave is used for the church and the west part of the church is used for offices. St. Nicholas Cole Abbey actually is a lunch place now. And when I first saw it in 1967, it was still totally just a shell. And this is on the left is the way it looked, and on the on the right here you can see the way it is now, just this huge barn-like room with a flat ceiling. St. Vedist is, or Vedist it's sometimes called, is considered one of Wren's most advanced designs because of the spire and its relationship to the Roman work of Borromini. But Wren never visited Rome, but he might have seen Borromini's work published. This was a beautiful interior, and it has also been restored as a collegiate church. The gold carving on the right is one of the original surviving elements of the church, with the descending dove symbolizing the Holy Spirit. And this church is now the church that incorporates the parish of St. Mary, Aldermanbury. It actually has, I believe, 24 parishes all merged into this parish, and the archivist is responsible for all of those birth and death records going back to the Middle Ages. So here's what Wren looked like in his later years, around the turn of the century. And one of them, the one on the left, he's actually holding a plan, but I'm not sure what the plan represents. On the right, he's is one of the many versions of what St. Paul's was intended to look like. And that was painted in 1711 by Godfrey Kneller, who was the court painter at the time. So there are only 9 churches that survived, that the interior survived the war. So we're down from 50 some to only 9. St. Benet's, which is now the Welsh church, was probably designed by Robert Hooke. And it has a very Protestant front to it, with the tablets representing the 10 Commandments in the center. St. Clement Eastcheap was repainted by Ninian Comper, who was a famous designer of church interiors. But most of the churches he worked on were new, or either that or they were high Victorian. So these colors seem particularly loud. And this is one of the problems among these 9 churches. Even many of these have been altered since the war. St. James Garlick Height is no longer open to the public because a crane fell on it in 1991. It took years of litigation to get the money to rebuild it, and now there's no parish. And St. Magnus the Martyr is a church that was right at the entrance to London Bridge. And you formerly could see this from the bridge and from the other side of the Thames. But as you can see, there's an office building that has been built in the small space between the tower and the river that blocks the view of it from the river today. This, you can see the view in the painting on the right, and behind it, the column that is the memorial to the Great Fire of London, that you can still, up until COVID, you could still climb up to the top. This is also mentioned by T.S. Eliot in one of his poems. And it is unique because the tower was modified so that people who were coming into the city on foot from London Bridge could walk under the tower. And so that took one part of one bay out of the nave, but otherwise it's one of the most beautiful interiors with these extremely tall Ionic columns and a lot of gilding, which is original. Most of the churches did not have much gilding. St. Margaret Lothbury is right behind the Bank of London, Bank of England, and it's well known because it has been a refuge for church fittings from other churches. And in particular, this arch is the same arch that we saw at All Hallows the Great, with spectacular carving. I think this is a phoenix here that looks a little bit like an eagle right over the opening of the screen. And that was very appropriate because, of course, it was a bird that rose from its own ashes, the way the city did after the Great Fire. St. Mary Abchurch was damaged in a fire not too long ago, but has been restored. And this is one of the only churches that has documented woodwork by Grinling Gibbons. Gibbons was the greatest woodcarver of the 17th century. And he did most of the major work at the cathedral, St. Paul's, and also at some of the royal palaces, including Kensington and Hampton Court. And he probably supervised much of the other woodwork in these churches, but this one has work that he actually did himself. And as you can see, it's a complete dome, a circle on a square. And so from a planning and architectural point of view, it's one of Wren's most outstanding buildings. St. Mary Aldermary was a Gothic church that was partly surviving. And so Wren used that as the basis for this design, including this very unusual roof, or ceiling rather, with these circular spaces, a little bit like a late perpendicular ceiling in a church from the 1500s. St. Stephen Walbrook is another dome that is on 8 points. And so it's one of the most complex and interesting plans of any of Wren's churches. It was not bombed in the war and all the fittings survived, but they were subsequently removed, except for the outer perimeter, when Henry Moore offered this large carved altar, and they changed the configuration of the church to be a central plan to accommodate that. But when you walk in, it's very obvious that the scale of the altar is too large for the building. And another building that has suffered from bad neighbors is St. Mary at Hill, which has this incredible office building designed by Raphael Vignoli. It rises and becomes larger at the top because there's supposed to be a public garden. It's not usually open to the public up there, unfortunately. And it is such an odd looking feature on the skyline of London that people call it the walkie-talkie. And I recently read, one man said that he had lived to see the completion of Liverpool Cathedral, and now his goal was to see the demolition of the walkie-talkie. And the church below it here, St. Mary at Hill, also suffered a fire, and this is what it looked like. It burned the whole roof off, but the interior fittings were completely salvageable. So they rebuilt the church, but they took out all the fittings, and today it looks just like an activity space, and that's how it's being used with the, this is a before and after pictures. Now, turning to St. Mary in a little more detail, this is what the church looked like in 1910. At some point in the 19th century, they had somebody wanted to give stained glass in the medieval style to the church, which of course was completely out of scale and out of character for Wren's churches, which had clear windows and clear light coming into them. And because so many of them were in constrained positions, they needed as much light as they could get. St. Mary's was lucky that it still had part of the garden, the churchyard next to it, and some prominent people buried there, including the two men who published the first folio of Shakespeare's plays. But they had changed a lot of the detailing to a kind of Italian Romanesque. And this is what the East End looked like. On the left is in 1830, and on the right is in 1890. And you can see how they took the oculus windows and turned them into wheel windows, how they added extra bars to the central window and changed the tower also, and added this grill along the roof line. So it burned. And one of the interesting things about the history of this church is that the man who was the fire warden in this parish on that particular night in 1940 was an organ maker named Noel Mander. And he subsequently created the organ for the new church in Fulton. And he said that was the greatest achievement in his life. So, but because the shell was still standing, it was rather carefully cleaned out on the inside and turned into an extension to the garden, the churchyard that was right next to it. And that's how you see it in the picture on the right. And I believe 5 of the 7 original capitals were still surviving too. The map on the left you can find in the Churchill Memorial in Fulton today, and you can see that so many people have touched it that they've worn away the pink color of the original location. But you can see that just to the left is All Hallows Wood Street with that Gothic apse, and then just to the south, just south of the big roof, which is the Guildhall, is the burned out walls of St. Lawrence Jewry. And this gives you a very good idea of how close together these churches were, and also how little was left. It was remarkable that they made the effort to save even these shells. And you can really see that on the right, because by the 1960s, even more of the surviving buildings had been torn down because the whole city was being rebuilt at a much larger scale. This is the way the churchyard is today. They left the footings for the columns, and then there's this memorial that mentions the restoration of the church in Fulton as a memorial to Winston Churchill. They took Marshal Sisson supervised the demolition of the building stone by stone, and they put it into packing crates that were numbered in a certain way. They arrived in Virginia, I think in Norfolk, Virginia, and then were changed to railroad cars. And by the time they got to Fulton, they were all out of order. So it took quite a while to re-establish the sequence that the stones were supposed to be put up in. And they started that in 1965. The foundation stone was laid in 1966, which was exactly to the day 300 years after the start of the Great Fire of London. And I should mention that the people who were the main movers in getting this project together included, in addition to Marshal Sisson, Patrick Horsborough, who was a art history professor, but had worked with Marshal Sisson in the past. And then the St. Louis architects, Emmett Layton and his wife, Ruth, and Fred Sternberg was actually the reconstruction architect. Sternberg's most familiar building is probably the Old Bonham Presbyterian Church, the very large, slightly Gothic looking church on Highway 40 or I-64 on Conway Road. This is an interesting model that you can see in the museum. And I have to thank John Gunther for taking a picture of this. As the key at the bottom of the picture says, the white wood in the center of the picture is the floor plan of the original medieval church. The columns then were partly on the foundations of the original church, but the new church was just ever so a few feet larger in all directions. There was a spiral staircase from the old medieval church that went down into the basement. And when that was actually moved to Fulton also, but today you find it going up in the tower from the organ loft level up to the bell level. This shows the rededication in 1969, and the speaker that day was Lord Mountbatten of Burma, who was a great grandson of Queen Victoria, and of course the uncle of Prince Philip, and an important figure in the royal family. And very distinguished in his own military career, so very appropriate. But in this view, above all, you can see that the church has been moved an entire story above the ground level, because they realized that a church did not make a good museum. And so in order to have the actual museum to Winston Churchill that they had intended, they had to have an enclosed space. And so they call it the crypt, I think, the lower level of the church. But Patrick Horsborough was so upset about this that he resigned from the project before they started re-erecting it in this location. And it is true that this elevation is of all the elevations, was the one that Wren really wanted people to see as they walk by it at ground level. They've just started a reconstruction or a restoration project, which will partly reconstruct that terrace to make it a little more watertight, and to make sure that it continues to hold up the rest of the roof. So the museum will be closed through 2021, regardless of the COVID rules changing. But they are hoping to have another grand opening at the end of next year. So let's look at the interior again. Again, take a note of the plan. Both the east wall and the west wall are at odd angles to the north and south walls. So that made it very difficult to reconstruct. And on the left, you can see that the big wooden element behind the altar, that usually we call that the reredos, had been cut down in the 19th century so that it wouldn't block the view of the stained glass, which had been contributed to the church. But otherwise, the church was in pretty good shape. This is how it's been reconstructed, with a reredos that's more appropriate to the period. The windows, of course, have been recreated in white glass, and all the original muntins have been replaced in the original pattern. And they still have I think the Lord's Prayer and the Ten Commandments in the two panels behind the altar. On the left and the right, you see these two vestries, which in some of the plans you've seen, the vestry was a completely separate room with a different ceiling level. But in this case, it's just a screened area of the side aisles. And the fronts of those, which you can see on the right, are actually salvaged from one of the previous churches that I mentioned earlier. Now I'm forgetting which one. St. Diana's Back Church. It was like the second or third church to be demolished, and it had been preserved somewhere all these years for over a century before it was moved to Fulton. The pulpit was added in 2001 as a memorial to Americans who died in the 9/11 disaster. And this was a church from All Hallows, the same place where that wooden screen came from. And this had been there in St. Mildred's Church until 2001, when the Diocese of London gave this to the people of the United States in commemoration of the loss that we suffered then. And here's a detail of the inscription that's right around the base of the pulpit. And then below that are the original carvings, which could be Grinling Gibbon carvings, showing these little heads of seraphs or cherubs, where you just see a head and wings, usually 4 wings rather than just 2. And you see those all throughout the interior of the church. Looking to the west, the organ loft has Noel Mander's organ, but it's built into an organ case from the 18th century that was used at Woolwich, which is the military base just outside the city of London in Kent. And you can also see some details here. To the right, the main carving is a pelican. A pelican is known as a sacrificial bird because in medieval zoology, they thought that the bird drew its own blood and fed its fledglings with that. Very self-sacrificing. And then on the left side, you can see a detail of the capitals. This is a composite order, which is one order more elegant, supposedly, than just Corinthian. It has a combination of Corinthian leaves and the volutes of the Ionic order combined. And as I mentioned, there were 7 surviving and 5 replacements. The new carvings were mostly done by a man named Arthur Ayres. And this is a wonderful example of his work, very much in the style of Grinling Gibbon's. This is the main seraph directly above the altar on the reredos, and showing the leaves and flowers on the left and right, and even a bunch of grapes there, all worked out in wood. The contrast of the backwood, which is oak probably, with the carved wood, which is linden, was something that was intended by Gibbons and Wren, but through the accumulation of dirt over the centuries, there are very few places in London where you can actually see this color contrast anymore. So that's one of the nice things about St. Mary's. So in conclusion, I want to say that I hope I've shown you in context that although this church isn't the most dramatic in terms of its planning, in terms of the accuracy of its restoration, it's one of the finest remaining Wren churches, and it's something that I think Missourians should be more proud of and visit more often. So thank you. If there are any questions, I'll be happy to answer them.
Thank you, Esley. That was a fabulous talk. This is Chris at the library, but not at the library right now. We did have one question earlier, and let me make sure I can get it. New message. Okay, here we go. From Yansheng, where did they put all the ruins after the 1616 fire to be later rebuilt? Or did they just leave the rubble there to be picked up later?
Well, in 1666, it took several years to clear out all the rubble. And I think they used it to fill in marshy areas, especially north of the city and east of the city, where the main dock areas of the harbor are in London. In 1941, and through World War II, I think pretty much the same thing happened, except that there was much more care about salvaging materials than there was in the earlier fire. As you can see from the way that ruins were left standing, in some cases for as much as 20 years before they finally decided what to do with them, rather than just move them out of the way because the city was growing. And in that sense, the Town Planning Act of 1947 played an important role. This was under Clement Attlee's administration and is one of the most sweeping laws in Europe, and of course far beyond anything in the United States at that time, to make historic preservation a central part of planning, city planning.
We're getting several comments. Looks like Esley stepped away for a second. Oh yes, thank you. Does anybody else have questions? If you want to enter them in the chat. Esley, we had Julie mention, she said she visited the church and museum in Fulton. It's a wonderful excursion and highly recommended. Did you say, so the church, do you think the church is open right now? Or is it just the museum that's closed through 2021?
Well, the church isn't open because of the COVID regulations.
Okay.
But it's the museum that they're primarily concerned about, and I think that they should be able to open the church at least from the west door once we are able to gather in groups again.
Wonderful. I guess if there's no further questions, I just want to let everybody know that we have another presentation next month, November 17th, and John Gunther will be presenting next month on St. Louis Gold, AIA gold medalists who have designed buildings in St. Louis. So we'd love to have you join us again. The registration is already up on our events page at St. Louis Public Library. So you can go to slpl.org and register. If you have any questions, my name and my phone number to my desk is there. So please contact me individually. But Esley, this has been a great, wonderful evening. And I feel like I know more than I started out knowing. So greatly appreciate your passion for architectural preservation and history, and for you sharing this tonight with us.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. Have a nice evening.